The morning alarm cut through the pre-dawn darkness at Camp Pendleton with its familiar harsh buzz, echoing across the sprawling complex of concrete barracks and training facilities. Steam rose from the mess hall's industrial vents, mixing the scent of coffee and scrambled eggs with the sharp bite of ocean air that rolled in from the Pacific just beyond the perimeter fence. The base stirred to life with the mechanical precision of a well-oiled machine, boots hitting polished floors in synchronized rhythm as hundreds of Marines began their daily routine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Outside, the California sun had not yet crested the distant mountains, leaving the training grounds bathed in the cool gray light of early morning. Dew clung to the chain-link fences that divided the various training areas and the asphalt paths. Between buildings gleamed with moisture that would burn off within the hour. The air carried the distinct smell of a military installation, diesel fuel from idling vehicles, the metallic tang of equipment, and the faint chlorine scent from the pool where water survival training took place twice weekly. At the heart of the base, the main training complex spread across several acres of carefully maintained grounds. Obstacle courses stretched in parallel lines, their wooden barriers and rope climbs standing like sentinels against the morning sky. Beyond them, the endurance track carved a precise oval through the landscape, its surface marked with white lines that had been repainted so many times they formed slight ridges in the asphalt. The track curved around a central field where Marines gathered for formation runs, PT tests, and the competitive events that measured their readiness for deployment. The barracks that housed the current training cycle rose in neat rows, their windows reflecting the growing light as the sky slowly shifted from gray to pale yellow. Each building contained dozens of Marines from across the country, brought together for the intensive 12-week program that would determine their specialties and assignments. Some came from urban backgrounds, others from rural towns, but all had survived the crucible of basic training and now faced the more specialized challenges that would shape their military careers. In the administrative building at the complex's center, fluorescent lights hummed to life as support staff began preparing for another day of coordinating training schedules, equipment distribution, and the endless paperwork that kept such a massive operation running smoothly. The building's main corridor stretched the length of a city block, lined with offices where instructors planned the day's exercises and where medical staff prepared to handle the inevitable minor injuries that came with intensive physical training. The equipment storage facilities occupied an entire section of the complex, massive warehouses filled with everything from basic PT gear to the full combat equipment that Marines would carry in the field. Rows of shelving reached toward high ceilings, stocked with backpacks, helmets, body armor, and the countless items that transformed a person into a fully equipped Marine. Forklifts moved between the aisles, operated by personnel who understood that proper gear distribution could mean the difference between successful training and dangerous situations. Near the eastern edge of the base, the motor pool came alive with the rumble of engines as transport vehicles prepared for the day's training exercises. Humvees lined up in precise formation, their olive drab paint dulled by years of use, but their mechanical systems maintained to military standards. The drivers, many of them Marines fulfilling support roles, conducted their pre-operation checks with the thoroughness that defined every aspect of military procedure. The mess hall had reached its peak activity, serving breakfast to waves of Marines who moved through the serving line with efficient speed. Trays clattered against metal rails as personnel selected from the standard military fare: eggs, bacon, toast, and the strong coffee that fueled early morning training sessions. Conversations buzzed with anticipation about the day ahead, speculation about upcoming exercises, and the casual banter that helped build bonds essential to military unit cohesion. Outside the mess hall, Marines gathered in small groups, some reviewing training schedules while others simply enjoyed the brief social time before the day's intensity began. Their uniforms were crisp despite the early hour, pressed and maintained according to standards that allowed no compromise. Name tags and rank insignia caught the growing light, marking the hierarchy that structured every interaction and decision. Within the base's boundaries, the medical facility stood ready with its complement of corpsmen and nurses, their stations stocked with the supplies needed to handle everything from minor scrapes to more serious training injuries. The facility's clean, sterile corridors contrasted sharply with the rough functionality of the training areas, but its presence provided essential safety oversight for the demanding physical activities that defined Marine training. Training instructors moved through the complex with purposeful strides, their bearing marking them as seasoned professionals who had transformed countless recruits into Marines. They carried clipboards filled with the day's schedules, checklists that would ensure every training objective was met, and the accumulated wisdom of years spent molding civilians into warriors. Their voices would soon ring out across the training areas, issuing commands, corrections, and encouragement in the distinctive cadence that Marines recognized instantly. The base's communication systems crackled to life as the morning's first announcements echoed from speakers mounted throughout the complex. Weather conditions, schedule modifications, and safety reminders flowed in the measured tones of professional military communication. Radio traffic increased as various departments coordinated their activities, ensuring that the complex choreography of military training would proceed without dangerous conflicts or equipment shortages in the distance. Aircraft from the nearby airfield added their own sounds to the morning symphony, their engines creating a low background rumble that Marines learned to ignore. The sound served as a constant reminder of the broader military mission that extended far beyond the confines of the training base, connecting these daily exercises to the global responsibilities that would define their future service. As the sun finally cleared the mountains, casting long shadows across the training grounds, the base transformed from a place of preparation into a theater of action. The careful orchestration of the early morning would soon give way to the controlled chaos of intensive training, where theories learned in classrooms would be tested against the physical and mental demands of military service. The obstacle courses that had stood silent in the pre-dawn darkness would soon echo with the sounds of Marines pushing themselves to their limits. The endurance track, still bearing traces of morning dew, would become a proving ground where fitness levels and determination would be measured against unforgiving standards. The equipment storage areas would empty as Marines drew the gear they would need for field exercises, transforming from administrative areas into the launching points for realistic training scenarios. Support personnel moved through this environment with quiet efficiency, their roles less visible than those of the training Marines but equally essential to the base's mission. They maintained the equipment, prepared the facilities, and handled the countless details that allowed the training instructors to focus on their primary responsibility, preparing Marines for the challenges they would face in service to their country. The morning air began to warm as California's reliable sunshine burned through the coastal moisture, promising another day of clear weather ideal for outdoor training. The base's location provided year-round conditions that allowed for consistent training schedules, a factor that had made it a cornerstone of Marine Corps' preparation for generations of service members. From the administrative buildings to the furthest training areas, Camp Pendleton represented the culmination of decades of military experience distilled into a comprehensive system for creating Marines. Every facility, every procedure, and every training exercise had been refined through practice, tested through necessity, and proven through the success of the Marines who had passed through its gates. The base operated on a schedule that began before dawn and continued well into the evening, maximizing the use of daylight hours for training while providing adequate time for rest, meals, and the administrative tasks that supported the primary mission. This rhythm had become second nature to everyone on the base, from the newest arrivals to the most experienced instructors, creating a shared sense of purpose that unified the diverse group of individuals who called Camp Pendleton their temporary home. As the morning progressed toward the official start of training activities, the base hummed with the energy of hundreds of people preparing to push themselves beyond comfortable limits. The challenges ahead would test physical fitness, mental toughness, and the teamwork skills essential to military effectiveness. Some would excel immediately, others would struggle before finding their stride, but all would be held to the same uncompromising standards that had defined Marine Corps training for over 2 centuries. The training grounds stood ready, their obstacles and challenges prepared to reveal which Marines possessed the qualities needed for advanced specialties and leadership roles. The endurance track waited silently, its measured distances prepared to separate those who merely met standards from those who exceeded them. And throughout the complex, Marines prepared to demonstrate that they belonged among the ranks of those who had earned the title through dedication, sacrifice, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. The stage was set for another day of testing, growth, and the forging of bonds that would last far beyond the 12 weeks of intensive training. As the sun climbed higher and the morning shadows shortened, Camp Pendleton prepared to fulfill its mission once again, transforming dedicated individuals into Marines ready to serve wherever duty might call them. Janice Miller moved through the equipment warehouse with deliberate precision, her clipboard balanced against her left forearm as she checked inventory numbers against the morning's distribution list. Each step carried a slight hitch, her right leg bearing the subtle mark of an old injury that forced her to favor her left side. The concrete floor echoed with the varied rhythms of footsteps, the sharp, synchronized beats of Marines collecting gear, and the slower, more measured pace of someone who had learned to navigate the world differently. She wore the standard issue utilities like everyone else on the base, but hers carried the creases that came from careful pressing rather than the crisp lines of recent issue. Her name tape read J. Miller in regulation black letters, positioned precisely above her right breast pocket. Unlike the Marines who moved through the warehouse in groups, sharing jokes and complaints about the day's upcoming training, Janice worked alone, her presence acknowledged with polite nods, but rarely with conversation. The morning light streaming through the warehouses, high windows caught the dust motes stirring around her as she reached for items on higher shelves. Her movements were efficient, economical, each action planned to minimize unnecessary motion. When she needed something from a top shelf, she used the stepladder kept nearby, climbing carefully but without hesitation. The slight drag of her right foot against each rung created a pattern that had become as familiar to her as breathing. Behind her, a group of Marines waited for their turn at the equipment counter, their conversation flowing with the easy confidence of people who had never questioned their place in their chosen world. One of them, a corporal named Davidson, whose muscular frame spoke of hours spent in the base gym, glanced toward Janice and shook his head with what might have been sympathy or dismissal. "Hard to believe they've got civilians handling our gear," he said to his companion, a lance corporal named Torres who was examining his newly issued pack straps. "No offense to her, but shouldn't this stuff be managed by people who actually know what it's like to carry it in the field?" Torres shrugged, adjusting the waist belt on his pack. "I heard she used to be in the military. Marine maybe, or Army. Something happened though. Medical discharge, I think." Preparing and narrating. This story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Makes sense," Davidson replied, watching as Janice carefully lowered a heavy ammunition case from its shelf position. "Shame, really, but at least she's still contributing somehow." Their voices carried the casual assumption that she couldn't hear them, or perhaps the expectation that she wouldn't respond even if she did. Janice continued her work without acknowledging their speculation, her face maintaining the neutral expression she had perfected over months of similar conversations. She had learned that responding to assumptions often created more complications than simply allowing them to persist. The equipment request she was processing belonged to Bravo Company, scheduled for a full field exercise that would test their readiness for deployment scenarios. Each Marine would carry approximately 60 pounds of gear across 15 miles of varied terrain, a standard that separated the adequately prepared from those who would struggle under real-world conditions. Janice checked each item against the list with meticulous care, understanding that equipment failures or shortages could compromise not just training objectives, but actual safety. As she worked, more Marines filtered through the warehouse, some collecting individual items while others waited for company-level distributions. The conversations around her painted a picture of the day's activities, a competitive exercise designed to evaluate unit cohesion and individual performance under stress. Winners would receive additional leave time and recognition in their service records. Those who failed to meet standards would face additional training and delayed advancement opportunities. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez appeared at the counter, his presence immediately commanding the attention of the Marines who had been casually discussing Janice's background. Rodriguez carried himself with the bearing of someone who had earned respect through competence rather than rank alone, his uniform bearing the subdued ribbons that marked combat service and advanced training qualifications. "Miller," he said, his voice carrying the professional courtesy that marked interactions between competent military personnel, regardless of their current status. "I need the specialist equipment for today's endurance trials. The GPS units, emergency medical supplies, and the backup communication gear." Janice nodded, setting aside her current task to retrieve the items Rodriguez had requested. The specialist equipment was stored in a separate, secured area that required additional clearance to access. As she moved toward the cage that contained these higher-value items, Rodriguez followed, his keycard ready to provide the secondary authorization needed to open the storage area. "Busy morning," Rodriguez observed as Janice began selecting the requested items. "Lot of interest in today's exercise. Word is that some of the newer Marines think they're going to set new records." "Equipment's all tested and ready," Janice replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who took pride in thorough preparation. Communication gear was cycled through diagnostics yesterday. Medical supplies were restocked after last week's training. GPS units are charged and calibrated. Rodriguez watched her work, noting the systematic way she checked each item before placing it in the distribution container. "You seem to know this gear pretty well. Most supply personnel need to check the manuals for the technical equipment." Janice paused in her inventory check, meeting Rodriguez's eyes briefly before returning to her work. "Experience helps," she said simply. "Some equipment becomes familiar after you've depended on it." The comment hung in the air between them, carrying implications that Rodriguez seemed to recognize, even if he chose not to pursue them immediately. Instead, he signed the distribution form that Janice presented, taking custody of equipment worth more than most people's annual salaries. "The endurance trial today," he said as she sealed the container. 15 miles with full combat load. Some of these Marines have been training for months specifically for this event. They think they understand what they're getting into. Janice secured the storage area and returned Rodriguez's keycard. "Understanding and doing are different things," she said. "Equipment can help, but it can't run the miles for you." Rodriguez smiled slightly, as if her response confirmed something he had suspected. "No, it can't. But some people seem to forget that fitness isn't just about what you can do in the gym. Real endurance gets tested when everything hurts and you still have to keep moving." As Rodriguez departed with his equipment, Janice returned to her routine. Inventory tasks. The warehouse had grown busier as the morning progressed. with Marines from multiple companies preparing for various training activities. The noise level increased correspondingly, voices echoing off the high ceiling and concrete walls in a constant buzz of military activity. Near the clothing issue area, a group of female Marines discussed the day's competitive events with obvious enthusiasm. Corporal Washington, whose PT scores consistently ranked in the top 10% of her training class, expressed confidence about the endurance trial. 15 miles is nothing, she said while collecting a replacement uniform item. I've been running 20-mile training runs 3 times a week. The full gear adds weight, but if you're in good shape, it shouldn't be a problem. Her companion, Private First Class Chun, nodded agreement while examining her newly issued boots. The real challenge will be beating the men's times. They keep saying women can't match their endurance, but I think we're going to surprise them. Definitely, Washington replied, especially with some of the guys thinking they can coast on upper body strength. Distance running is about efficiency and pacing, not just raw power. Their conversation continued as they moved away from Janice's area, but their words carried the confidence of people who had trained extensively and believed in their preparation. Like many of the Marines preparing for the day's events, they approached the challenge with the assumption that adequate preparation and determination would be sufficient to excel. Throughout the morning, Janice observed the steady stream of personnel preparing for training activities that would push them to their limits. She saw the careful attention they paid to their equipment, the serious discussions about strategy and pacing, and the underlying excitement that came with opportunities to prove themselves against demanding standards. Her own preparation for the day was different, limited to ensuring that all distributed equipment met specifications and that emergency supplies were positioned appropriately around the training areas. The rhythm of her work provided a steady counterpoint to the excitement building around the competitive events. While Marines debated optimal pacing strategies and discussed their training preparations, Janice focused on the details that would support their efforts, ensuring that communication equipment functioned properly, verifying that medical supplies were accessible, and confirming that all safety protocols were in place. As the morning wore on, the warehouse gradually emptied as Marines departed for pre-exercise briefings and equipment checks. The conversations that had filled the space with energy faded to echoes, leaving behind the quieter sounds of ongoing inventory management and equipment maintenance. Janice continued her work with the same methodical precision, her slight limp marking time against the concrete floor like a metronome, keeping rhythm in an empty concert hall. The clipboard in her hands contained more than just inventory lists. Notes in her careful handwriting tracked equipment performance, identified items that would need replacement or repair, and documented the countless details that kept the complex logistics of military training functioning smoothly. Her role might be overlooked by those who collected gear and departed for dramatic challenges, but the success of their efforts depended on the foundation of reliability she helped maintain. Outside the warehouse, the base continued its preparation for the day's major training event. Voices carried on the warming air as Marines assembled in formation areas, receiving final briefings about safety procedures, performance standards, and the recognition that would come with exceptional performance. The endurance trial that would soon test their limits had become the focal point of weeks of preparation and months of training. Inside the warehouse, Janice completed her morning inventory with the satisfaction that came from work done thoroughly and correctly. The slight asymmetry of her gait had carried her through another day of essential but unrecognized service. Her contribution measured not in dramatic achievements, but in the steady reliability that allowed others to pursue their own moments of glory. The stage was set for the day's main event, with equipment distributed, safety measures in place, and Marines prepared to test themselves against demanding standards. As the warehouse grew quiet around her, Janice prepared for the next phase of her day, unaware that the afternoon would bring opportunities she had not anticipated, and challenges that would surprise everyone who thought they understood her limitations. Afternoon sun blazed overhead as Marines assembled on the parade ground adjacent to the endurance track, their combat gear arranged in precise rows beside them. The weight of full battle rattle helmet, body armor, ammunition, water, and field pack created dark patches of sweat on uniforms, despite the relatively cool ocean breeze that swept across the base. Conversations buzzed with nervous energy as competitors made final adjustments to their equipment and discussed pacing strategies for the grueling 15-mile course ahead. Colonel Marcus Brennan stood at the elevated platform overlooking the assembly area, his silver eagles catching the sunlight as he surveyed the Marines preparing for what had become the most anticipated training event of the current cycle. Brennan commanded respect through a combination of combat experience and the kind of physical fitness that younger Marines aspired to achieve. His presence alone elevated the significance of any training exercise, and today's endurance trial had drawn additional attention from visiting officers and training evaluation teams. Ladies and gentlemen, Brennan's voice carried easily across the assembly area without amplification, trained through years of addressing troops in challenging conditions. Today's exercise will test your readiness for the physical demands you'll face in operational environments. 15 miles with 60 pounds of gear across varied terrain, with elevation changes and obstacles designed to simulate real-world conditions. The Marines listened with the focused attention that Brennan's reputation commanded. Among them, the strongest runners had positioned themselves near the front of the formation, their confidence evident in their posture and the casual way they wore gear that would exhaust less prepared individuals within the first few miles. Corporal Davidson adjusted his pack straps one final time, the bulky frame sitting comfortably on his broad shoulders. His training regimen had focused specifically on this type of challenge, with weighted runs becoming a daily routine that had built both his physical capacity and his confidence. Beside him, Corporal Washington completed her equipment check with the methodical precision that had made her one of the top-performing Marines in her training class. The time standard for this course is 2 hours and 30 minutes, Brennan continued. Exceptional performance, anything under 2 hours and 15 minutes, earns recognition in your service record and additional liberty privileges. Those who fail to complete the course within 3 hours will receive additional conditioning and repeat the trial next week. A murmur of acknowledgement rippled through the formation as Marines mentally calculated pace requirements and considered their strategies for managing the demanding timeline. The course they would face included sections of loose sand, steep inclines, stream crossings, and a particularly challenging stretch through dense vegetation that would test both physical endurance and mental determination. Behind the main formation, near the support vehicles that would provide water stations and emergency medical coverage, Janice completed her final safety inspection of the communication equipment that would coordinate the exercise. Her role required her to monitor the course from various checkpoint positions, ensuring that any Marines experiencing difficulties could receive immediate assistance. Master Sergeant Thompson, the senior enlisted advisor responsible for training coordination, approached Janice's position with a radio frequency list and course timeline. Thompson had served 3 combat deployments and carried himself with the quiet authority that came from leading Marines through actual combat operations. "Miller, you'll be monitoring from Checkpoint 3 today," Thompson said, handing her the coordination paperwork. "That's the midpoint station, about 7.5 miles into the course. The medical team will be positioned there as well in case anyone needs assistance." Janice reviewed the documents quickly, noting the timing intervals and communication protocols that would ensure proper safety coverage throughout the exercise. "Vehicle access to Checkpoint 3?" she asked, already planning her route to the monitoring position. "Negative," Thompson replied. "Checkpoint 3 is accessible only on foot." about a half-mile hike from the nearest vehicle access point. You'll need to position yourself there before the lead runners arrive. The implication was clear. Janice would need to cover difficult terrain with her equipment, reaching her assigned position before the fastest Marines completed nearly 8 miles of demanding running. Thompson's expression suggested he was reconsidering the assignment, perhaps thinking that someone with more mobility might be better suited for the remote checkpoint position. From the main formation, Davidson's voice carried over the pre-exercise preparations as he discussed strategy with his training partners. The key is to start conservatively and build speed after the first 5 miles, he was saying. Most people burn out trying to maintain too fast a pace early on. The real race starts when everyone's already tired. His confidence reflected weeks of specific preparation for this type of challenge. Davidson had studied the course layout, practiced with full gear, and developed a nutrition and hydration strategy that he believed would give him a competitive advantage. Like many of the Marines preparing for the trial, he approached the challenge with the assumption that adequate preparation and physical fitness would be sufficient to excel. Near the front of the formation, Washington completed her final equipment adjustments while discussing the course with Chen and 2 other female Marines who had trained together throughout their time at the base. Their conversation reflected both excitement about the competitive opportunity and determination to demonstrate that gender would not be a limiting factor in their performance. The elevation changes in the middle section will separate the real runners from the sprinters, Washington observed, checking her hydration system one final time. That's where we can make up ground on some of the guys who rely too much on upper body strength. Chen nodded agreement, her own preparation having focused on the technical aspects of running with heavy gear. Efficient stride and breathing rhythm matter more than raw speed when you're carrying this much weight. It's going to be about who can maintain form when everyone else starts falling apart. Their conversation reflected the serious preparation that most Marines had invested in the challenge. Training runs with progressively heavier loads, nutrition experimentation, and careful attention to equipment fit had occupied weeks of their schedules. The endurance trial represented not just a training requirement, but an opportunity to earn recognition and prove their readiness for advanced training opportunities. Colonel Brennan's voice cut through the various preparation activities as he prepared to deliver final instructions. Marines who fail to maintain proper spacing will be penalized. Those who attempt to assist struggling participants will be disqualified unless specifically directed by medical personnel. This is an individual assessment of your capabilities under stress. The rules reinforce the competitive nature of the exercise while maintaining safety standards that reflected the serious physical demands of the course. Marines nodded understanding, their expressions reflecting the mental transition from preparation to performance mindset. As the final briefing continued, Thompson returned to Janice's position with what appeared to be a change of plans. Miller, we've got a problem with Checkpoint 3 staffing. The Marine originally assigned twisted his ankle during morning PT. I need someone at that position, but it's a challenging location to reach. Before Janice could respond, Davidson's voice carried from the formation as he joked with his companions about the day's competition. Hope they've got plenty of medical support positioned around the course. Some of these people are going to learn the difference between gym fitness and real endurance today. His comment drew chuckles from Marines near enough to hear, the kind of casual confidence that came from believing in their superior preparation and physical capabilities. The implication that some participants might struggle or require medical assistance reflected assumptions about who belonged in demanding physical competitions and who might be better suited for support roles. Thompson continued his discussion with Janice, unaware of the developing situation around them. Getting to Checkpoint 3 will require covering some of the same terrain the Marines will run, but at your own pace. Can you handle that distance with the monitoring equipment? The question hung in the air as nearby Marines began to notice The conversation. Davidson turned from his group, his attention caught by the mention of someone covering part of the endurance course route. His expression shifted from casual interest to something approaching disbelief as he realized that Janice was being asked to traverse challenging terrain that would test even well-conditioned Marines. "Sergeant Thompson," Davidson interjected, his voice carrying the concern of someone who believed he was preventing a potentially dangerous situation. "Ma'am, with respect, Checkpoint 3 involves some pretty rough terrain. Maybe someone else should handle that position?" Thompson paused, glancing between Davidson and Janice as other Marines began to focus on the exchange. The conversation had attracted attention from the broader formation, creating an impromptu audience for what was becoming an uncomfortable discussion about capabilities and limitations. Washington stepped closer, her expression reflecting genuine concern rather than mockery. "The checkpoint route includes some steep sections and loose footing. It's not an easy hike even without equipment." Additional Marines gathered around the conversation, their post-exercise attention drawn by the developing situation. The discussion that had begun as a simple logistics coordination was evolving into something more significant, with implications that extended beyond the immediate question of checkpoint staffing. Janice stood quietly during the exchange, her expression neutral as Marines discussed her capabilities and limitations, as if she were not present. The familiar pattern of well-intentioned concern, mixed with assumptions about what someone with her visible limitations could reasonably be expected to accomplish. The clipboard in her hands contained detailed course information, but the gathering Marine seemed more focused on her limp than her qualifications for the assignment. "Maybe," Davidson continued, his voice carrying the tone of someone offering helpful advice, "we could set up the monitoring equipment at Checkpoint 2 instead. That's accessible by vehicle, and it would still provide good coverage of the middle sections." The suggestion reflected the kind of accommodation that Janice had encountered throughout her time at the base. Well-meaning adjustments that reduced challenges while simultaneously reducing opportunities. The assumption that difficult terrain was inherently beyond her capabilities had become so routine that most people offered alternatives without considering whether she might be capable of meeting the original requirements. Colonel Brennan's attention shifted toward the gathering discussion, his expression indicating that the delay in final preparations was beginning to affect the exercise timeline. The Marines assembled for the endurance trial remained in formation, but their focus had begun to drift toward the conversation that was delaying the start of their competition. Thompson looked between the gathered Marines and Janice, clearly weighing the competing concerns of safety, logistics, and the growing attention that the situation was attracting. The checkpoint position needed to be staffed, but the discussion had evolved beyond simple assignment coordination into something that required more careful consideration. "The checkpoint equipment isn't particularly heavy," Janice said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had settled over the nearby Marines. "And I've reviewed the route specifications. It's challenging terrain, but it's not technically difficult." Her response carried the calm confidence of someone who had evaluated the requirements and reached her own conclusions about their manageability. The gathering Marines exchanged glances, their expressions reflecting the mixture of surprise at her directness and continued concern about the wisdom of the assignment. Davidson shook his head slightly, his concern evident despite his effort to maintain a respectful tone. "Ma'am, no disrespect intended, but that route would be challenging for Marines who've been training specifically for this type of terrain. Maybe there's a better way to handle the checkpoint coverage?" The question implied that Janice's limitations were obvious to everyone present, and that suggesting she could handle the assignment was either naive or potentially dangerous. The gathering crowd of Marines nodded agreement, their body language reflecting consensus that accommodation would be both appropriate and necessary. The conversation had reached a point where resolution was required, with Colonel Brennan's attention focused on the delay and the Marines scheduled for the endurance trial, waiting for final instructions. Thompson faced a decision that would determine not only checkpoint staffing, but also whether Janice would be given the opportunity to demonstrate capabilities that others assumed she lacked. The weight of the monitoring equipment settled against Janice's shoulders as she adjusted the pack straps, the familiar pressure triggering memories that she had learned to manage but never entirely suppressed. The radio system, medical supplies, and checkpoint coordination materials added approximately 25 pounds to her load, not the 60 pounds that the competing Marines would carry, but substantial enough that the assembled observers exchanged skeptical glances as she prepared for the hike to the remote monitoring position. As she checked the equipment connections one final time, her mind drifted backward through years that felt simultaneously distant and immediate. The limp that marked her every step had become such a defining characteristic in others, perceptions that few people ever asked about the experiences that preceded it. The story began not with injury or limitation, but with a different version of herself entirely. 15 years earlier, Second Lieutenant Janice Miller had graduated third in her class from the Naval Academy, her senior thesis on military logistics, earning recognition from the Pentagon's Efficiency Review Board. Her commissioning ceremony had been attended by parents whose own military service had inspired her childhood dreams of following in their footsteps. Her father, a career Marine who had served in 3 combat deployments, had pinned her gold bars with hands that shook slightly from pride rather than age. The young officer who reported to her first assignment at Quantico bore little resemblance to the quiet supply coordinator who now faced skeptical assumptions about her physical capabilities. Lieutenant Miller had been an accomplished distance runner throughout her academy years, her personal best in the marathon placing her among the top military competitors in inter-service competitions. Her running style had been economical and efficient, built around the principle that endurance was more about mental discipline than natural talent. Her first deployment had taken her to Afghanistan's mountainous eastern provinces, where supply convoys faced constant threats from improvised explosive devices and small arms attacks. As a logistics officer, her responsibility involved coordinating the movement of equipment and supplies across terrain that challenged even the most experienced drivers and route planners. The work required detailed knowledge of vehicle capabilities, fuel consumption rates, and the countless variables that could turn routine supply runs into life-threatening situations. The mountain roads of Afghanistan had taught her lessons about endurance that no academy training could have provided. Convoys moved at the pace of their slowest vehicles, often covering distances that would take civilians hours in a fraction of that time due to security concerns and mechanical failures. She had learned to calculate fuel loads, water requirements, and equipment redundancies while maintaining the mental alertness necessary to identify potential threats along routes that change daily based on intelligence reports and enemy activity patterns. During her second deployment, Lieutenant Miller had volunteered for a specialized program that embedded logistics officers with frontline combat units. The assignment required her to accompany infantry patrols, carrying her own equipment while maintaining the communication links and supply coordination that kept remote units connected to their support infrastructure. The work demanded physical fitness that exceeded standard military requirements and mental toughness that could function effectively under direct fire. The patrols she accompanied covered distances that would challenge even experienced hikers, but with the added complexity of carrying combat loads across terrain selected for its defensive advantages rather than ease of movement. Afghan mountains tested every aspect of physical conditioning, with altitude, temperature extremes, and irregular footing, creating conditions that revealed the difference between gymnasium fitness and operational capability. Her running background had provided advantages that became apparent during extended operations. While other officers struggled with the cardiovascular demands of high-altitude patrol work, She maintained the steady breathing rhythm and efficient stride that conserved energy over long distances. Her fellow Marines began requesting her presence on particularly challenging missions, recognizing that her endurance and tactical communication skills enhanced unit effectiveness in remote areas. The specialized assignment had lasted 18 months, during which she had covered hundreds of miles on foot across some of the world's most challenging terrain. Her equipment load typically exceeded 60 pounds, including communication gear, medical supplies, and the navigation equipment that provided crucial links between frontline units and their command structure. The work had refined her understanding of how equipment selection, load distribution, and pacing strategies affected performance under stress. Her running had evolved during deployment from a personal fitness activity into a tactical advantage that contributed directly to mission success. Long-range patrols required sustained movement across distances that exhausted Marines who relied primarily on strength rather than endurance. Her ability to maintain pace while carrying substantial loads had made her an asset to units that faced multi-day operations in remote areas with limited vehicle support. The injury that ended her deployment career had occurred during what should have been a routine patrol in a supposedly secure area. An improvised explosive device buried beneath a section of trail that her unit had used without incident dozens of times had detonated just as she moved past the trigger point. The blast had thrown her against a boulder, resulting in complex fractures to her right leg that required multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation. The medical evacuations, first to Germany and then to Walter Reed, had been followed by a year of reconstructive surgery and physical therapy that gradually rebuilt her ability to walk, but left her with the permanent reminder that accompanied every step. The doctors had been honest about her prognosis. She would walk normally for most daily activities, but the biomechanical changes would prevent her from returning to the physical demands of combat deployment. The medical board that evaluated her fitness for continued service had been respectful but definitive. Her injuries were incompatible with the physical requirements of her specialty, and while accommodation could be made for administrative roles, the kind of field work that had defined her career was no longer possible. The recommendation for medical retirement had been presented as a positive outcome, emphasizing the benefits and recognition she had earned through her service. The transition to civilian life had been more challenging than any Afghan mountain trail. Physical therapy had restored her mobility but couldn't address the psychological adjustment of defining herself outside the military identity that had shaped her adult life. Running, which had been both profession and passion, became a painful reminder of capabilities that would never fully return. The decision to accept the civilian contractor position at Camp Pendleton had been motivated partly by financial necessity and partly by a desire to remain connected to the military environment that still felt like home. The work involved the same logistical expertise she had developed during deployment, but from the safety of a well-equipped base rather than the uncertainty of remote patrol operations. Her colleagues at the base knew her as the quiet, competent supply coordinator who ensured that training exercises proceeded smoothly and safely. Few were aware that she had once carried similar equipment across terrain, more challenging than anything they would face during training. The assumptions about her limitations had become so routine that she rarely bothered to correct them, finding it easier to focus on her work than to explain a background that most people couldn't relate to. The monitoring equipment she now carried represented a fraction of the load she had managed during deployment, but the skeptical expressions around her suggested that even this reduced requirement was being questioned. The Marines preparing for their endurance trial were focused on proving themselves against demanding standards, unaware that the person they doubted had already proven herself under conditions that exceeded anything they would face during training. As she completed her equipment check, fragments of muscle memory returned from patrols where proper gear management had meant the difference between mission success and failure. the radio positioning that ensured clear communication, the water distribution that maintained hydration without creating noise, and the pack adjustment that prevented pressure points during long movements, all skills that had been refined through necessity rather than training manuals. The checkpoint route that concerned the watching Marines represented approximately 4 miles of varied terrain, including elevation changes and loose footing that would challenge anyone carrying the equipment. For Janice, it was reminiscent of patrol movements she had completed dozens of times, though without the additional stress of potential enemy contact and with the luxury of predetermined rest stops and emergency support. The irony of the situation was not lost on her as she prepared to demonstrate capabilities that others assumed she lacked. The same Marines who questioned her ability to cover challenging terrain were about to attempt an endurance trial that would test their limits using skills and knowledge that she had developed through years of operational experience. The difference was that their test would end with recognition and advancement opportunities, while her demonstration would likely be dismissed as an exception or attributed to factors other than her actual capabilities. Standing among Marines who had trained extensively for their upcoming challenge, Janice carried the quiet confidence of someone who had already proven herself under conditions that exceeded anything they would face. The limp that marked her as limited in their perception was the visible reminder of experiences that had tested and refined her endurance in ways that no training program could replicate. The memories of mountain patrols where every step had carried tactical significance and every equipment decision could affect unit survival provided a context for the current situation that the watching Marines couldn't appreciate. The terrain that concerned them was challenging by training standards, but familiar territory for someone who had navigated Afghan mountains while carrying the responsibility for keeping combat units connected to their lifelines. As Colonel Brennan's attention returned to the delayed exercise timeline, Janice adjusted her equipment load one final time and prepared to address the assumptions that had shaped others' expectations about her capabilities. The checkpoint position needed to be staffed, the endurance trial needed to proceed, and the Marines who had questioned her assignment were about to receive an education about the difference between perceived limitations and actual capabilities. Colonel Brennan's voice cut through the lingering discussions with the authority that had commanded Marines across 2 decades of service. Thompson, whatever checkpoint arrangements you're making need to be finalized now. We have a schedule to maintain and Marines waiting to be tested. Master Sergeant Thompson nodded sharply, his decision crystallizing under the pressure of delayed timelines and gathered attention. Miller, you have the Checkpoint 3 assignment. Move out and establish position. Lead runners should reach your area in approximately 90 minutes. The finality in Thompson's voice ended the discussion about alternatives and accommodations. Janice adjusted her pack straps one final time, the monitoring equipment settling into the familiar weight distribution that her body remembered from different circumstances. Around her, the Marines who had questioned the assignment watched with expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed anticipation of difficulty. "Roger that, Master Sergeant," Janice replied, her voice carrying the crisp acknowledgement that marked professional military communication. She turned toward the trailhead that would take her cross-country to the remote monitoring position, her first steps carrying the slight irregularity that had become the focus of so much speculation about her capabilities. Davidson called out behind her, his tone carrying what he clearly intended as helpful encouragement. "Take your time getting there, ma'am. No point in pushing too hard on that terrain." Janice paused briefly, glancing back at the assembled Marines, with an expression that revealed nothing of her thoughts. "I'll be in position when you arrive," she said simply, then continued toward the trail without further comment. The route to Checkpoint 3 began on established paths used for routine training activities, but quickly diverged into the more challenging terrain that had prompted concerns about the assignment. The initial section crossed relatively level ground, allowing Janice to establish the rhythm and pacing that would carry her through the more demanding portions ahead. Behind her, the endurance trial preparation continued with final equipment, checks and competitive banter that reflected the Marines' focus on their upcoming test. Colonel Brennan's voice carried across the assembly area as he delivered last-minute instructions about safety protocols and performance standards. The competitive energy that had built throughout the morning was approaching its release point as Marines prepared to prove themselves against demanding physical standards. Janice moved steadily along the trail, her pack riding comfortably despite the skeptical assumptions about her ability to manage the load. The monitoring equipment she carried included communication gear that would provide coordination between checkpoint positions, medical supplies for emergency response, and navigation equipment that would ensure precise location reporting if assistance became necessary. The first challenging section appeared after approximately 1 mile, where the trail began climbing through rocky terrain that required careful foot placement and route selection. The gradient was steep enough to test cardiovascular fitness, while the loose footing demanded attention to balance and momentum. Marines training for the endurance trial often struggled with this section when carrying their full combat loads, finding that techniques effective on smooth surfaces became inadequate on irregular terrain. Janice approached the climb with the methodical efficiency that deployment experience had ingrained. Each step was placed deliberately, her weight shifting smoothly from foot to foot in a pattern that conserved energy while maintaining forward progress. The slight drag of her injured leg created a rhythm that was different from textbook running form, but effective for sustained movement. Across challenging terrain, her breathing settled into the controlled pattern that had carried her through Afghan mountains, each inhalation timed to support her effort without creating the oxygen debt that would force rest stops. The pack weight that had concerned watching Marines felt familiar, significantly lighter than the load she had managed during combat operations, but substantial enough to require proper distribution and movement techniques. As she climbed, memories of similar terrain in Afghanistan provided context for the current challenge. The rocky slopes around forward operating base Shank had been far more demanding than this training route, with the added stress of potential enemy contact and the responsibility for maintaining communication with units whose lives depended on reliable coordination. The current hike was challenging by training standards, but felt almost recreational compared to patrol movements, where every step carried tactical significance. The trail crested the first major elevation gain and descended briefly before beginning the second major challenge, a traverse across loose scree that would test balance and route-finding skills. This section had been specifically included in the endurance course to simulate the kind of terrain that Marines might encounter in mountainous deployment areas. Many competitors would slow significantly here, finding that the unstable footing disrupted their pacing and challenged their confidence. Janice evaluated the scree field with the eye of someone who had navigated far worse conditions under significantly greater pressure. The route selection that would provide the most stable footing was apparent from her evaluation of slope angles and rock size distribution. She moved across the traverse with steady progress, each step tested briefly before committing her full weight, her injured leg adapting to the irregular surface without compromising her forward momentum. The communication radio crackled with traffic as the endurance trial officially commenced, Colonel Brennan's voice announcing the start as Marines began their 15-mile test under full combat loads. The lead runners would maintain aggressive paces for the first several miles, their training focused on building early leads that would sustain them through the more challenging middle sections of the course. Checkpoint 3 lay approximately 2 miles ahead, across terrain that would continue to test both physical conditioning and technical movement skills. The remaining route included stream crossings, dense vegetation, and the steep descent that had concerned Master Sergeant Thompson when he originally planned the checkpoint assignments. Janice maintained her steady pace, aware that she needed to reach position well before the fastest Marines completed their 7.5-mile approach. The stream crossing appeared after another mile of challenging but manageable terrain. The water was knee-deep and flowing swiftly enough to create stability challenges for anyone carrying substantial equipment loads. Standard military technique required careful entry and exit to prevent slips that could damage equipment or cause injuries. The current was strong enough that maintaining balance demanded attention to foot placement and weight distribution. Janice approached the crossing with the confidence that came from having navigated similar obstacles under combat conditions. The water was cold against her legs as she entered, each step placed carefully on the rocky bottom while maintaining the pat position that would preserve her center of gravity. The crossing technique she employed had been refined through necessity during Afghan operations, where stream crossings often occurred while maintaining tactical awareness and communication schedules. Emerging from the water, she paused briefly to check her equipment and ensure that the communication gear remained functional. The radio test confirmed clear reception, and the navigation equipment showed her position tracking correctly toward the checkpoint coordinates. Behind her, the trail showed evidence of her passage, but no signs of difficulty or delay that would support the assumptions about her limitations. The final approach to Checkpoint 3 required navigating the steep descent that had been Thompson's primary concern when assigning the position. The trail dropped approximately 400 feet over half a mile, with switchbacks that controlled the gradient, but required careful attention to prevent controlled descents from becoming dangerous slides. Marines carrying full combat loads often found this section particularly challenging, as the forward momentum generated by their equipment weight could overwhelm their ability to maintain controlled movement. Janice descended with the measured technique that had kept her safe during far more dangerous movements in hostile territory. Each step was controlled, her pace adjusted to prevent the momentum buildup that could lead to falls or equipment damage. The slight irregularity of her gait actually provided advantages here, as the careful foot placement required by her injury translated into the deliberate movement that steep descents demanded. The Checkpoint 3 positions appeared below her as the trail completed its descent, a small clearing beside a seasonal creek that provided the communication line of sight and emergency vehicle access that made it suitable for monitoring purposes. The location offered clear views of the trail sections where Marines would pass during the middle portion of their endurance trial, allowing effective observation of their condition and progress. As Janice reached the checkpoint position with time to spare, her arrival occurring nearly 30 minutes before the fastest runners were projected to reach the midpoint of their course. The hike that had generated skeptical discussions among watching Marines had been completed without incident and ahead of schedule, despite the challenging terrain and substantial equipment load that had prompted concerns about her capabilities. She established the monitoring station with systematic efficiency that reflected both her supply coordination experience and her deployment background. The communication equipment was positioned for optimal signal transmission, the medical supplies were arranged for immediate access, and the observation position was selected to provide clear views of approaching runners while maintaining safety margins from the trail. The radio check with base coordination confirmed her position and communication status. Master Sergeant Thompson's voice carrying slight surprise at her early arrival. Checkpoint 3, this is base coordination. You're showing green on all systems and ahead of the timeline. Status report. Checkpoint 3 established and operational, Janice replied. Clear visibility on approach routes, communication systems functional, medical supplies ready for deployment. Standing by for runner arrivals. The professional competence in her voice carried no hint of the exertion that the watching Marines had anticipated. Her breathing was steady, her equipment properly positioned, and her readiness complete. The hike that had generated so much concern had been accomplished with the efficiency that marked her approach to all assigned tasks. As she waited for the first runners to appear on the distant trail, Janice reflected on the irony of her situation. The Marines who had questioned her assignment were now struggling through the early miles of their endurance trial, their carefully planned pacing strategies being tested against terrain that would reveal the difference between training preparation and operational capability. Meanwhile, the person they had doubted was positioned and ready, having covered challenging terrain while carrying substantial equipment loads ahead of schedule. The morning sun had given way to afternoon heat that would add another layer of difficulty to the Marines' trial. She had water and medical supplies ready for runners who might be experiencing difficulty, communication equipment that would coordinate any emergency responses, and the hard-earned knowledge of what it truly meant to endure challenging conditions while maintaining mission effectiveness. In the distance, dust clouds marked the approach of the lead runners, their progress visible as they navigated the trail sections that would bring them to her position. The moment of truth was approaching for the Marines who had trained extensively for this test, and for the assumptions that had shaped their expectations about her own capabilities. The radio crackled with position reports from other checkpoints as the endurance trial reached its crucial middle phase. Soon, the runners who had questioned her assignment would arrive at her position, having covered 7.5 miles under conditions that would test everything they had learned about endurance, pacing, and mental toughness. They would find her waiting, professionally positioned, and fully prepared, having demonstrated capabilities that exceeded their assumptions about what someone with her limitations could accomplish. The first dust cloud appeared on the distant trail at exactly the time Janice had calculated, based on the fastest projected pace for the lead runners. Through her binoculars, she could make out two figures moving in the steady rhythm that marked experienced distance runners managing their energy across demanding terrain. Even at this distance, their form showed the efficiency that separated elite performers from those who relied primarily on raw fitness to overcome challenging conditions. Her radio crackled with coordination traffic as other checkpoint positions reported the passage of lead runners through their sectors. The times being reported confirmed that the fastest Marines were maintaining aggressive paces despite the challenging terrain and substantial equipment loads they carried. Their performance reflected months of specific preparation and the kind of competitive drive that pushed individuals beyond their perceived limitations. As the lead runners approached closer, Janice could identify their faces and recognize the controlled breathing that indicated they were managing the physical demands effectively. Corporal Washington led by approximately 50 meters, her stride showing the mechanical efficiency that had made her one of the top performers throughout the training cycle. Behind her, Lance Corporal Martinez maintained a pace that suggested he was prepared to challenge for the lead during the course's final sections. Washington crested the final rise before the checkpoint with the smooth acceleration that marked someone who had conserved energy for the challenging middle sections. Her equipment rode properly positioned despite 7.5 miles of varied terrain, and her face showed concentration rather than the strain that would indicate approaching limitations. She was executing her race strategy effectively and appeared capable of maintaining her performance through the remaining distance. As she approached the checkpoint station, Washington's expression shifted from focused concentration to surprise and then confusion. Her pace slowed slightly as she processed the sight of Janice positioned professionally at the monitoring station, communication equipment operational, and medical supplies arranged for immediate deployment. The person who had been the subject of concerned discussions about her ability to reach this remote position was clearly established and prepared, having arrived well ahead of the fastest Marines in the competition. Checkpoint 3, runner number 14 passing through, Washington called out as she approached, her voice carrying the professional acknowledgement required by exercise protocols. Her eyes remained fixed on Janice, however, as if trying to reconcile the reality of the situation with her Expectations about how this assignment should have developed. Janice marked the passage, time and runner identification on her coordination log, her voice carrying the calm professionalism that had marked her communication throughout the morning. Runner 14 logged at checkpoint 3, time 14:23. Hydration station available if needed. Washington slowed to accept a water bottle, using the brief pause to study Janice more carefully. The monitoring station was completely operational, positioned optimally for communication and observation, and showing no signs of the difficulties that might have been expected from someone struggling to reach a challenging location. Instead, everything appeared to have been established with the systematic efficiency that marked professional military operations. "Ma'am," Washington said, her breathing controlled despite the physical demands she had been managing. "How long have you been positioned here?" "Approximately 45 minutes, Janice replied, checking her chronometer to provide the precise information that military coordination required. The station was established ahead of schedule with full communication and medical capability. The implication was clear to Washington, whose own calculation abilities allowed her to understand what that timeline meant. For Janice to have been positioned for 45 minutes, she would have needed to complete the challenging cross-country route in significantly less time than the most optimistic projections had suggested. More importantly, she would have needed to do so while carrying substantial equipment and establishing a fully functional monitoring station. Martinez arrived at the checkpoint as Washington was processing this information, his own surprise evident as he recognized the professional setup that greeted him. Like Washington, he had participated in the discussions about the wisdom of assigning someone with obvious limitations to cover challenging terrain, and his assumptions about the likely outcome had been definitively contradicted by the reality he now faced. "Checkpoint 3, runner 17 passing through," Martinez announced, his voice carrying the automatic professionalism of military training while his expression reflected confusion about how the situation had developed so differently from his expectations. Janice logged his passage with the same efficient accuracy she had shown for Washington, offering hydration and confirming his condition for the coordination reports that would track all participants through the demanding course. Her demeanor remained calm and professional, showing no indication that she was aware of the assumptions that had shaped others' expectations about her assignment. Additional runners began arriving in the steady stream that marked the middle portion of the pack, their times and conditions reflecting the range of preparation and capability that characterized any large group of competitors. Some showed the controlled efficiency of strong performers, while others displayed the early signs of fatigue that would challenge their ability to complete the remaining distance within acceptable standards. Among the arriving Marines was Corporal Davidson, whose earlier comments about the assignment had reflected genuine concern, mixed with assumptions about physical limitations. His arrival at Checkpoint 3 occurred nearly 20 minutes after the lead runners, his pace showing the effects of terrain that had proven more challenging than his training had fully prepared him to handle. Davidson's surprise at finding Janice professionally positioned and operational was evident in his expression and the slight hesitation in his stride as he approached the checkpoint. The person whose capabilities he had questioned was clearly established and functioning effectively, while his own performance was beginning to show the strain of demands that had exceeded his preparation. "Checkpoint 3, runner 28 passing through," Davidson announced, his breathing showing more strain than the earlier arrivals had displayed. The professional acknowledgement was automatic, but his attention remained focused on the monitoring station that had been established with obvious competence and efficiency. Janice marked his passage and offered water, her professional demeanor unchanged despite the contrast between current reality and the assumptions that had shaped the morning's discussions. Davidson accepted the hydration with visible gratitude, using the brief pause to study the checkpoint setup more carefully. The monitoring equipment was positioned for optimal effectiveness, The medical supplies were arranged for immediate deployment, and the entire station showed the systematic organization that reflected both experience and professional competence. Nothing about the setup suggested struggle, accommodation, or the kind of improvisation that might have been expected if someone had been challenged by the assignment requirements. "Ma'am," Davidson said, his voice carrying respect that had been absent from his earlier comments, "this is excellent positioning. Communication coverage looks optimal from here." His observation reflected genuine appreciation for professional competence, but also carried the implicit acknowledgement that his assumptions about her capabilities had been incorrect. The monitoring station represented not just adequate performance, but superior execution of a challenging assignment under demanding conditions. As more Marines arrived throughout the afternoon, the pattern of surprise and recognition continued. Each runner who had participated in the morning's discussions about the wisdom of the assignment found themselves confronting evidence that contradicted their assumptions about what someone with visible limitations could reasonably be expected to accomplish. The radio traffic that Janice coordinated painted a picture of the endurance trial's progression through its most challenging phases. Some Marines were performing exceptionally, maintaining paces that would earn them recognition and advancement opportunities. Others were struggling with demands that exceeded their preparation, requiring medical evaluation and potential course modifications to ensure their safety. Master Sergeant Thompson's voice appeared on the coordination frequency as the afternoon progressed, requesting status updates from all checkpoint positions. The reports that came back painted a comprehensive picture of the exercise's development, with Janice's position providing some of the most detailed and professionally formatted information. "Checkpoint 3, this is base coordination," Thompson's voice carried over the radio. "Request detailed status on station operations and runner conditions." Janice's response reflected the systematic reporting that had characterized her communication throughout the deployment operations that had shaped her professional development. "Base coordination. Checkpoint 3 reports full operational status. 47 runners logged through position. Average passage time 14 minutes 27 seconds. 3 runners required extended hydration. All continued course completion. Medical supplies at 70%. Communication systems optimal. Observation coverage complete." The precision and completeness of her report stood in marked contrast to the simpler acknowledgments that came from other checkpoint positions. Thompson's slight pause before acknowledging suggested that he was processing both the professional quality of her coordination and the implications of her successful execution of an assignment that had generated significant concern. "Outstanding work, Checkpoint 3, Thompson replied. "Maintain position and continue coordination through completion of rudder passage." The acknowledgement carried the respect that professional competence earned in military environments, but also represented a significant shift from the morning's discussions about accommodations and alternative assignments. The reality of her performance had superseded the assumptions that had shaped initial expectations about her capabilities. As the afternoon continued, word of the Checkpoint 3 situation began spreading through the base's communication networks. Marines returning from other sections of the course carried reports about the professional monitoring station that had been established in one of the most challenging locations, operated by the supply coordinator whose limitations had been the subject of morning speculation. Colonel Brennan appeared on the coordination frequency during the late afternoon, his voice carrying the authority that commanded immediate attention throughout the exercise area. "All checkpoint positions, this is Base Command. Provide final operational status and prepare for exercise termination procedures." The series of reports that followed painted a comprehensive picture of the endurance trial's successful completion, with Checkpoint 3 providing some of the most detailed and professionally executed coordination. Janice's final report covered runner statistics, equipment status, and operational observations that reflected both her deployment experience and her thorough understanding of logistics coordination under demanding conditions. Checkpoint 3. Base command. Brennan's voice carried particular attention as he addressed her position. Outstanding coordination throughout the exercise. Your operational reports have been exceptional. The recognition from the base commander represented more than acknowledgement of adequate performance. It marked professional respect for superior execution under challenging conditions, delivered by someone whose capabilities had been systematically underestimated by those who focused on visible limitations rather than demonstrated competence. As the exercise concluded and Marines began their recovery procedures, the conversations throughout the base reflected a significant shift in perception about assumptions and capabilities. The Checkpoint 3 assignments that had generated concern and offers of accommodation had been executed with professional excellence that exceeded rather than merely met the demanding requirements. The Marines who had questioned the assignment now faced the uncomfortable recognition that their assumptions had been based on limited understanding rather than accurate assessment. The person they had sought to protect from challenging assignments had demonstrated capabilities that exceeded those of many who had considered themselves more qualified for demanding tasks. Davidson approached the checkpoint station as Janice secured her equipment for transport back to base, his expression carrying the respect that came from witnessing professional competence that contradicted his expectations. "Ma'am, I owe you an apology. Your performance today has been exceptional, and my earlier comments were inappropriate." His acknowledgement reflected the kind of professional growth that marked effective military personnel, the ability to recognize when assumptions had been incorrect and to adjust expectations based on demonstrated reality rather than surface perceptions. The evening shadows stretched across Camp Pendleton as the last of the endurance trial participants completed their demanding 15-mile course. The base had settled into the quieter rhythm that followed intensive training exercises, with Marines focused on equipment maintenance, recovery procedures, and the informal discussions that processed the day's experiences. The competitive energy that had marked the morning's preparations had given way to the satisfaction that came from testing personal limits and discovering capabilities that exceeded previous expectations. In the equipment warehouse where the day had begun, Janice completed the systematic inventory and maintenance procedures that ensured all distributed gear was accounted for and properly prepared for future training activities. The monitoring equipment she had carried to Checkpoint 3 was cleaned, tested, and returned to its designated storage position with the methodical care that characterized her approach to all professional responsibilities. The warehouse had resumed its normal operational tempo, but the conversations that echoed between the shelving units carried a different tone from the morning's casual assumptions about limitations and appropriate assignments. Marines who had witnessed or heard about the Checkpoint 3 situation discussed the day's events with the kind of respectful attention that professional competence commanded in military environments. Corporal Washington appeared at the equipment counter during the evening's final distribution period, her uniform showing the evidence of successful completion of one of the most demanding physical tests in the current training cycle. Her performance had earned recognition as the fastest overall completion time, but her expression carried thoughtful consideration rather than simple celebration of personal achievement. "Ma'am," Washington said, her voice carrying the respect that had replaced the morning's well-intentioned concerns. "I wanted to thank you for the professional support at Checkpoint 3 today. Your coordination made a significant difference in the exercise's success." Janice looked up from her inventory documentation, meeting Washington's eyes with the calm acknowledgement that marked her interactions with all base personnel. "Just doing my job, Corporal. Glad the exercise went well for you." The simplicity of her response reflected the quiet dignity that had characterized her throughout the day's events. She sought no credit beyond professional competence, no recognition that extended beyond the successful completion of assigned responsibilities. The extraordinary nature of her performance was evident to those who understood the challenges involved, but she treated it as the normal execution of routine duties. Washington hesitated briefly, as if considering whether to pursue the conversation further. "Ma'am, if I may ask, your movement techniques on that terrain were impressive. That route challenges Marines who've been training specifically for those conditions." The question carried genuine curiosity rather than the skeptical assumptions that had shaped the morning's discussions. Washington had covered enough challenging terrain to recognize the difference between adequate performance and superior technique, and her observation reflected professional appreciation for demonstrated expertise. "Experience helps," Janice replied simply, her voice carrying no elaboration about the deployment background that had provided that experience. "Challenging terrain requires attention to technique rather than just physical fitness." Her response offered insight without claiming special recognition, acknowledging that her performance reflected learned skills rather than exceptional circumstances. The distinction was important to someone who had always defined herself through competence rather than dramatic achievements or overcoming obvious obstacles. Lance Corporal Martinez joined the conversation as he completed his own equipment return. Procedures, his earlier skepticism replaced by the curiosity that competent professionals showed when encountering superior performance in unexpected contexts. His endurance trial completion had been respectable but not exceptional, and his experience at Checkpoint 3 had provided perspective on the difference between assumption and reality. "Ma'am, several of us were discussing the checkpoint operations," Martinez said, his tone carrying genuine interest rather than the patronizing concern that had marked earlier exchanges. "Your coordination was some of the most professional we've seen during training exercises." The acknowledgement reflected growing recognition that the morning's assumptions about her capabilities had been fundamentally incorrect. Rather than someone requiring accommodation or protection from challenging assignments, she had demonstrated expertise that exceeded the performance of many who had considered themselves more qualified for demanding tasks. Master Sergeant Thompson entered the warehouse during the evening's final administrative period, his presence immediately commanding the attention of Marines completing their post-exercise procedures. Thompson's evaluation of the day's training activities would influence future exercise planning and individual performance assessments, making his observations particularly significant for those seeking advancement opportunities. "Miller," Thompson said, his voice carrying the professional acknowledgement that marked interactions between competent military personnel. "I need to discuss today's checkpoint operations with you." The formal tone suggested an official evaluation rather than casual conversation, drawing the attention of Marines within hearing distance, who had developed interest in how the day's unexpected developments would be addressed through official channels. Janice set aside her inventory documentation and gave Thompson her full attention, her posture reflecting the professional responsiveness that had characterized her throughout the assignment. "Yes, Master Sergeant." Thompson consulted his evaluation clipboard briefly before continuing. "Your Checkpoint 3 coordination exceeded all performance standards for remote monitoring positions. Communication reports were comprehensive. Timely, medical readiness was optimal, and station operations demonstrated superior professional competence." The formal recognition represented more than acknowledgement of adequate performance. Thompson's evaluation carried implications for future assignment opportunities and official recognition of capabilities that had been systematically underestimated by those who focused on visible limitations rather than demonstrated competence. "Furthermore," Thompson continued, "your operational reports provided some of the most valuable coordination data we've collected during recent training cycles. The detailed runner condition assessments and terrain analysis will influence future exercise planning." The acknowledgement that her professional contributions had value beyond the immediate assignment reflected a significant shift from the morning's discussions about accommodations and limitations. Rather than someone whose capabilities required careful management, she was being recognized as someone whose expertise enhanced overall operational effectiveness. Colonel Brennan's appearance in the warehouse created the immediate attention shift that senior leadership commanded throughout military installations. His presence during routine administrative periods was unusual, suggesting that the day's events had generated command-level interest that extended beyond normal training evaluation. Procedures. As you were, Brennan said, preventing the formal attention positions that his rank normally required. His focus was clearly on Janice rather than the broader warehouse operations, indicating that her performance had attracted the kind of leadership attention that could influence career opportunities and professional recognition. Brennan sighed, his voice carrying the respect that effective commanders showed to competent personnel, regardless of their current assignment status. I've reviewed the after-action reports from today's endurance trial. Your checkpoint operations were exceptional. The recognition from the base commander represented the highest level of professional acknowledgement available within the current organizational structure. Brennan's evaluation would carry significant weight in any future discussions about assignment opportunities and capability assessments. Thank you, sir, Janice replied, her response carrying appropriate military courtesy. Without seeking to expand the recognition beyond its professional context, she had learned that competent performance spoke more effectively than verbal elaboration about challenges overcome or assumptions contradicted. Brennan consulted his own evaluation materials before continuing. I'm recommending you for the Civilian Contractor Excellence Recognition Program. Your performance today demonstrated the kind of professional competence that enhances our training mission effectiveness. The recommendation represented tangible recognition that would appear in her official record and influence future opportunity assessments. More importantly, it marked official acknowledgement that her capabilities extended well beyond the limitations that others had assumed based on visible differences. Additionally, Brennan continued, I'm establishing a new position for advanced logistics coordination that would utilize your demonstrated expertise in challenging operational environments. The position would involve coordination responsibilities for our most demanding training exercises. The offer represented a significant advancement from her current supply coordination role, acknowledging capabilities that had been revealed through her performance rather than assumptions about appropriate accommodations. The position would provide opportunities to utilize skills developed through deployment experience, while contributing to training objectives that enhanced Marine readiness for operational challenges. As the formal recognition concluded and evening administrative procedures resumed their normal pace, conversations throughout the warehouse reflected the broader implications of the day's events. Marines who had begun the morning with casual assumptions about limitations and appropriate assignments now discussed the importance of recognizing capabilities that might not be immediately apparent through surface observations. Davidson approached Janice's workstation as she completed her final inventory procedures, his expression carrying the thoughtful consideration that marked someone who had learned important lessons about assumptions and professional judgment. His earlier comments about her assignment had reflected genuine concern, but his current understanding acknowledged that his assumptions had been based on incomplete information. Ma'am, Davidson said, his voice carrying sincere respect rather than the patronizing concern that had marked his morning comments. Today taught me something important about making assumptions about people's capabilities. Your performance was outstanding, and I learned a valuable lesson about professional judgment. His acknowledgement reflected the kind of personal growth that marked effective military development, the ability to recognize when assumptions had been incorrect and to adjust future evaluations based on demonstrated reality rather than surface perceptions. The lesson extended beyond individual capability assessment to broader questions about how organizations identified and utilized the full range of talents available within their personnel. Janice accepted his recognition with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her throughout the day's events. "Everyone has different strengths, Corporal. Sometimes they're just not immediately obvious." Her response carried wisdom earned through years of proving herself in environments where assumptions about limitations had to be overcome through consistent demonstration of competence. The lesson she offered was applicable far beyond military training exercises, touching on fundamental questions about how societies recognized and utilized human potential. As the evening concluded and Marines departed for well-earned rest after their demanding training day, the warehouse returned to its normal quiet efficiency. Equipment was secured, documentation was completed, and the systematic preparations began for the following day's training activities. The routine procedures continued unchanged, but the conversations and attitudes that would shape future interactions had been fundamentally altered by the day's demonstrations of capability exceeding assumption. Janice completed her final administrative tasks with the same methodical precision that had marked her professional performance throughout her time at the base. The recognition she had received was gratifying, but her satisfaction came primarily from the successful completion of challenging assignments that contributed to training objectives and Marine readiness. The slight irregularity in her gait remained unchanged as she secured the warehouse for the evening, but the assumptions that others made about its implications had been permanently altered. The Marines who had questioned her assignment now understood that visible differences did not necessarily indicate limitations, and that professional competence could exceed expectations in ways that challenged comfortable assumptions about capability and appropriate opportunity. The day had demonstrated that true strength often resided in those who had learned to overcome challenges rather than those who had never faced them. Janice's performance had shown that experience, determination, and professional competence could transcend visible limitations and exceed the expectations of those who had trained extensively for the same challenges. As the base settled into evening quiet, the lessons of the day would influence future interactions and decisions about capability, assessment, and opportunity allocation. The endurance trial had tested more than physical fitness and mental toughness. It had examined assumptions about human potential and revealed the importance of recognizing strength that might not conform to traditional expectations. The story that had begun with skeptical concern about inappropriate assignments had concluded with professional recognition and expanded opportunities that acknowledged capabilities previously overlooked. More importantly, it demonstrated that real strength often lay not in the absence of challenges, but in the quiet competence developed through overcoming them with dignity and grace. The following weeks brought subtle but significant changes to the daily rhythm of base operations. Word of the checkpoint 3 situations had spread through the informal communication networks that connected military installations, carrying lessons that extended far beyond the specific circumstances of one training exercise. Visiting officers from other bases requested briefings on the advanced logistics coordination program that had emerged from Janice's demonstrated capabilities, seeking to understand how similar expertise might be identified and utilized within their own organizations. The new position that Colonel Brennan had established required Janice to coordinate the most challenging training exercises across multiple Marine units, her responsibilities expanding to include advanced terrain analysis, equipment optimization studies, and the development of performance standards that would better prepare Marines for deployment conditions. The work utilized skills that had been honed through combat experience, but had been overlooked by those who focused on visible limitations rather than demonstrated competence. Her first major assignment in the expanded role involved coordinating a joint service training exercise that would test interoperability between Marine, Army, and Special Operations units across terrain that simulated Middle Eastern operational environments. The complexity of the coordination required understanding equipment capabilities, logistics requirements, and performance standards across different military branches, each with their own procedures and expectations. The planning meetings that preceded the exercise brought together senior officers from multiple services. Their discussions focused on the technical challenges of coordinating diverse units with different equipment standards and operational procedures. Janice's contributions to these discussions reflected both her deployment experience and her comprehensive understanding of how equipment limitations and terrain factors affected operational effectiveness. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chun, the Army representative responsible for inter-service coordination, reviewed Janice's terrain analysis with obvious appreciation for the detailed recommendations about route selection, checkpoint positioning, and equipment optimization that would enhance the exercise's realism and training value. This level of operational detail is exceptional, Chun observed, studying the comprehensive briefing materials that Janice had prepared. The equipment load calculations and terrain difficulty assessments show understanding of factors that many experienced officers overlook. The recognition reflected growing appreciation for expertise that had been systematically underutilized due to assumptions about appropriate assignments and capability limitations. The same knowledge that had been dismissed as irrelevant to someone in a supply coordination role was now being recognized as valuable expertise that enhanced training effectiveness and operational readiness. Major Rodriguez, representing Special Operations Coordination, added his own evaluation of the planning materials. The checkpoint positioning recommendations demonstrate understanding of tactical movement principles that would be valuable for our advanced training programs. This isn't just logistics coordination. It's operational planning at a sophisticated level. The acknowledgement that her contributions extended beyond routine administrative support to tactical expertise marked another significant shift in how her capabilities were perceived and utilized. The deployment experience that had shaped her understanding of terrain, equipment, and operational factors was finally being recognized as relevant professional knowledge rather than irrelevant background information. As the joint exercise approached, Janice found herself working directly with unit commanders to optimize their preparation strategies and equipment selections. The conversations that had once focused on accommodating her limitations now centered on utilizing her expertise to enhance training outcomes and better prepare Marines for the challenges they would face during deployment. Captain Williams, whose unit would participate in the most demanding portions of the exercise, sought her input on load optimization strategies that would allow his Marines to maintain effectiveness across extended operations. Your recommendations about equipment selection have already improved our training performance, he acknowledged. The techniques you've suggested for managing gear weight and distribution are more effective than anything we learned through standard training programs. The recognition that her knowledge enhanced rather than merely supported training objectives represented a fundamental shift from the assumptions that had characterized her early interactions at the base. Rather than someone whose contributions were limited by physical constraints, she was being recognized as someone whose experience provided advantages that enhanced overall organizational effectiveness. The joint exercise itself unfolded with the precision that reflected comprehensive planning and coordination across multiple military services. The checkpoint positions that Janice had recommended provided optimal monitoring coverage while maintaining the realism that made the training valuable. The equipment optimization strategies she had developed allowed participating units to maintain higher performance levels throughout the demanding scenarios. Colonel Brennan's evaluation of the exercise results included specific recognition of the coordination effectiveness that had contributed to the training's success. The level of operational planning and execution coordination exceeded our expectations and established new standards for inter-service training exercises, his after-action report noted. The advanced logistics coordination demonstrated capabilities that should be incorporated into future training development. The success of the joint exercise led to additional opportunities that further expanded Janice's professional responsibilities and recognition. Requests for her expertise came from training commands across the Marine Corps, seeking consultation on terrain analysis, equipment optimization, and the development of training standards that would better prepare Marines for operational challenges. National Defense University invited her to present her research on equipment effectiveness and terrain analysis to senior military officers pursuing advanced education in logistics and operational planning. The presentation, delivered to an audience that included colonels and general officers from multiple services, marked formal academic recognition of expertise that had been developed through practical experience rather than traditional educational pathways. The integration of operational experience with systematic analysis provides insights that enhance our understanding of how equipment decisions affect tactical effectiveness, commented Brigadier General Patricia Foster, whose own background included extensive deployment command experience. This represents the kind of practical knowledge that should inform policy development and training standardization. The academic recognition reflected broader appreciation for the value of experience-based expertise that transcended traditional career pathway limitations. The knowledge that Janice had developed through deployment operations was now being recognized as academically significant research that could influence military policy and training development. Her research into equipment effectiveness under challenging conditions led to collaboration with defense contractors, seeking to improve gear design based on operational feedback from experienced users. The recommendations she provided about pack design, weight distribution, and durability requirements influenced product development that would benefit future generations of military personnel. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, included her input in their development of next-generation load carriage systems, recognizing that her combination of extensive field experience and systematic analysis provided insights that pure laboratory testing could not replicate. The consultation work added another dimension to her professional recognition while contributing to innovations that would enhance military effectiveness. Years later, Marines training at Camp Pendleton would complete endurance trials using equipment and techniques that had been influenced by research that emerged from one person's demonstration that capabilities often exceeded assumptions based on visible limitations. The Checkpoint 3 situation had evolved from a single training exercise into systemic improvements that enhanced military readiness and effectiveness. Warehouse, where her journey had begun, remained the center of her daily responsibilities. But the conversations that echoed between the equipment shelves now reflected understanding that professional competence could transcend physical challenges and that valuable expertise might be found in unexpected contexts. New Marines arriving at the base learned from the beginning that assumptions about limitations often reflected incomplete understanding rather than accurate assessment. Master Sergeant Thompson, whose decision to maintain the Checkpoint 3 assignments had initiated the day's revelations, became an advocate for comprehensive capability assessment that looked beyond surface characteristics to identify hidden strengths within military organizations. His recommendations influenced personnel evaluation procedures that sought to identify and utilize the full range of talents available within military units. The most valuable lesson from that exercise, Thompson would tell new Marines during orientation briefings, was learning that real strength often develops through overcoming challenges rather than avoiding them. The person you assume has limitations might be the one with the most valuable experience for solving difficult problems. The lesson that had emerged from one training exercise had grown into institutional wisdom that influenced how the Marine Corps identified, developed, and utilized human potential. The story of Checkpoint 3 became part of the unofficial education that shaped how Marines understood professional competence, personal character, and the importance of looking beyond surface characteristics to recognize true capability. Janice continued her work with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her throughout the journey from overlooked supply coordinator to recognized expert in operational logistics and training development. The limp that had once been seen as a limitation was now understood as evidence of experience that had developed valuable expertise through challenging circumstances. The recognition she had earned was satisfying, but her greatest fulfillment came from knowing that her experience had contributed to better preparation for Marines who would face operational challenges in service to their country. The lessons learned through her own journey had become knowledge that enhanced military effectiveness and potentially saved lives in dangerous environments. The transformation from assumptions about limitations to recognition of exceptional capability had demonstrated that human potential often exceeded comfortable categorizations based on visible characteristics. The story that had begun with skeptical concern about inappropriate assignments had evolved into institutional change that better recognized and utilized the diverse strengths within military organizations. Most importantly, the journey had shown that true strength was often found not in those who had never faced challenges, but in those who had learned to excel despite them. The quiet competence that Janice had demonstrated had proven more valuable than the loud confidence of those who had never been tested by genuine adversity. Her legacy would live on in the improved training, better equipment, and enhanced understanding that her expertise had contributed to military effectiveness for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.